Many histories of economics, especially if they're Anglophone, locate the beginnings of economics with Adam Smith's classic Wealth of Nations, together with the works of David Ricardo and the Mills, James, and John Stuart. Others, more historically ecumenical and less Britannically insular, might look upon the mercantilists of an earlier age as proto-economists. Still others would include the Franco-Hibernian Richard Cantillon and the physiocrats among economics originators. While the names of the founders and significant contributors of economics may differ from list to list, the suggestion that there is anything of value of economic theory to be found in the speculations of scholastic philosophers is likely to invite skepticism. An exception to this general skepticism might be the contribution made to monetary economics by the late scholastics. This is due in no small part to the work of Marjorie Grice Hutchinson. As an exemplary skeptic, we may instance the economic historian Mark Blaug, who regards his fellow economic historian Joseph Schumpeter's treatment of scholastic economics as excessively laudatory, and who devotes a mere 3 pages out of over 700 of his own monumental volume to them. Blaug concludes, "One may doubt, therefore, whether recent work on scholastic economics required a revision of the history of economic thought prior to Adam Smith." Another skeptic, George Reisman, concedes that some discussions of economic matters took place among scholastic philosophers in the Middle Ages, but he judges that they appraised economic activity largely from the hostile perspective of the Roman Catholic Church, and accordingly denounced as unjust such perfectly normal economic activities as the taking of interest on loans, speculation, and indeed even the mere changing of prices. He concludes categorically that the scholastics contributed nothing to sound economics. While I believe that Blaug and Reisman seriously err in their estimations of the contributions of the scholastics to economics, it is nonetheless true that economics in the thought of the scholastics occupied a subordinate position, derivative upon their reflections on ethics and law. This is not to suggest that the scholastic approach to economics is beyond criticism. Even Raymond de Roover admits, speaking of St. Bernardino, but the point is extendable to all scholastics, that his preoccupation with ethics blinded him to the need for more careful analysis of economic processes. Their viewpoint on economics was coloured not only by ethics but also by their interest in law. Raymond de Roover writes, "Not only did the scholastics look at economics from an ethical standpoint, they were also legally minded. In addition to the Bible, the Church Fathers, and the philosopher Aristotle, canon and Roman law were their main sources of inspiration, and their treatises bristled with reference to Gratian's Decretum, the Decretals, and the Corpus Juris Civilis of Emperor Justinian." Marjorie Grice Hutchinson agrees with de Roover, remarking that the writers of the Salamanca school were primarily theologians and jurists who did indeed think about social and economic matters, but for whom these thoughts were secondary. The economic reflections of St. Antonino are to be found in his Summa Moralis. De Roover says, "One should not be surprised to find economics discussed in a work of this kind, since it was not yet recognized as an independent discipline, but was still linked to moral theology or philosophy. This was still true in the 18th century. Was not Adam Smith professor of moral philosophy?" Marjorie Grice Hutchinson remarks that before the rise of mercantilism in the 16th century, when political economy came into being as a separate subject of study, economic analysis existed only as a byproduct of legal, theological, and philosophical inquiry. This was almost entirely centred in the schools, as the newly founded universities were called. Such analysis as they, the doctors, produced was generally developed in commentaries on Aristotle or St. Thomas, or in the examination of contracts. This method led to a patchwork of theory. Leaving aside the matter of the historical development of economics within the context of ethical reflection, the conceptual relationship between ethics and economics is complex. Human action falls under the prescriptions of the natural law as normative, so much is obvious. However, it also needs to be considered under the natural law as descriptive. One can usefully distinguish between different kinds of economics. For our purposes, it suffices to distinguish between the science of economics and the ethics of economics. The scholastics did not always distinguish between the science of economics and the ethics of economics, certainly not explicitly. But much of what they have to say in this area can only be appreciated if this distinction is borne in mind. The science of economics is the study of the formal implications that can be deduced from the fact of human action and that, in so acting, man acts purposely for ends. As such, the science of economics is non-normative. The ethics of economics, like all ethics, is essentially normative in orientation. It considers whether and to what extent human economic acts are good or evil. Schaffen remarks, as moral theologians, the late scholastics devoted the majority of their efforts to the discussion of what is just and good. With their attention focused on the broad spectrum of human action, it is natural for them to study economic issues. Such questions as the right to charge interest, the propriety of profits, the ethics of monetary intervention, the justice of taxes, were, in their view, not only appropriate but essential topics of discussion. They recognized the need to study all aspects of the phenomena, that is, interest, profits, taxes, and so on, before making ethical valuations. They knew that, when properly conducted, such study is value-free. A key point to understand is that, whatever may be the ethical implications of certain notions, the objective interconnection of their objective correlates is what it is, as Schaffen puts it. It is important to note, however, that while ethical considerations may either promote or hinder scientific development, they have no impact on underlying truth. For example, no ethical judgment can invalidate an economic law. Happily, not all scholars agree with the negative judgments of Reisman and Blaug outlined above. Gloria Zuniga writes, the economic legacy of the schoolmen was thought to be a foolish notion of just price and an obsession with usury. This is antiquated and erroneous. The development of economic thought progressed mainly from the contributions of the scholastics. Others, such as Raymond de Roover, would agree with Zuniga's judgment on the positive contributions of the schoolmen to economics, but would be less inclined than she to regard the negative view as totally unfounded. As de Roover puts it, the schoolmen devoted so much space to this one subject, namely usury, and overrated one problem to the neglect of many others, that they created the impression of being devoid of a sense of balance. To see that Zuniga's claim regarding the contribution of the schoolmen to economic thought is not fantastic, consider the list of topics dealt with in the 14th–15th century St. Bernardina's De Contractibus et Usuris. In addition to an extensive discussion of usury, these include private property, the need for trade, business ethics, and the determination of value and price. According to Marjorie Grice Hutchinson, the 16th and 17th century Spanish scholastics concerned themselves with private property, taxation, poor relief, price, usury, money, banking, and foreign exchange. Without wishing to fall into the antiquated and erroneous view noted by Zuniga, I shall concentrate in the remainder of this lecture on the scholastic treatment of usury, utility, value and price, and exchange. Not because these were by any means the only matters they discussed. Other topics treated include, of course, property, taxation, money and banking, but because they illustrate very clearly both the strengths and the weaknesses of the scholastic approach to economics and the significant respects in which they contributed lastingly to economic theory. If the scholastics are associated in the popular mind with the notion of usury, this is largely because they struggled in their articulation of this concept to reconcile Scripture, the philosophers, in particular the philosopher, Aristotle, and reason. The basic problem here came from what appeared to be a scriptural prohibition on the charging of interest on a loan. Some interpreted this as enjoining a complete ban, others as the prohibition on the charging of excessive interest. After some uncertainty in practice, Pope Clement V at the Council of Vienna condemned usury absolutely. Grice Hutchinson remarks, the Mosaic prohibition of usury, then, presented the same dilemma to the members of the three religious communities of medieval Spain. Should the taboo be observed in its original purity, or circumvented to suit the facts of business life? Jews, Muslims, and Christians, in turn, chose the second course, but in each case only after a tenacious, centuries-long struggle. Today, usury is taken to be the charging of excessive rates of interest on loans. It's important to realize that this is not what the scholastics meant by the term. For them, usury was the charging of any amount, large or small, over and above the principal. Not only did the amount of the extra charge not matter, it mattered not what the loan was for, nor whom the loan was made to, nor the circumstances of lender or borrower. However, it is equally important to understand that usury was associated only with loans and not with any other kind of contract. Because the prohibition of usury applied only to loans, those wishing to circumvent the prohibition could disguise the loan under the form of another type of contract. A loan, in turn, was a contract whose matter was fungible goods, such as grain, wine, or money, whose use was inseparable from their substance. Quantity X of grain loaned from A to B required the return by B to A of an equal quantity of grain, no more, no less. The assumption throughout is that such fungibles are consumed by the borrower and are not productive of any increase in wealth. Philosophical support for this position seemed to come from Aristotle, who, deeming that money had no intrinsic value, generates an utility itself and is merely the product of a human convention. If money has no intrinsic value, then a lender of such loses nothing by giving it temporarily to another. If he receives back exactly what he gave, then there would appear to be an absolute equality. As early as the middle of the 16th century, a quantity theory of money is articulated by Azpilicueta, Dr. Navarrete, in which the value of money, like all other goods, is determined by supply and demand. Money, of course, in an obvious sense, is absolutely sterile. If left in the drawer, or as in the case of the parable in St. Matthew's Gospel, buried in the ground, it produces no offspring. However, those acquainted with the parable of the talents should have noted that the recipients of the talents were expected to return not just the talents they were given, but also an increase, and not just an increase from trade, as with the first two servants, but, as the parable explicitly states, even from interest. Then, says the master, you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. What's being missed in regarding money as sterile is the understanding of money as capital, or perhaps better, as productive of capital, that is then employed to generate an increase in real wealth. The scholastics appear to be at best ambiguous on this matter. Aquinas, for example, within the space of a few lines, appears both to support the account of money as sterile and also an account of money as fruitful. St. Bernardino, too, seems to want to uphold the thesis that money is sterile and, at the same time, to recognize its seminal quality in its use as capital in investment. Of course, it doesn't take much reflection to see that the Aristotelian doctrine that a lender loses nothing in making a loan will not bear scrutiny, and indeed, the scholastics came to recognize certain exceptions to the universal prohibition of usury. Within the context of a loan proper, the scholastics considered, and in many cases accepted, so-called extrinsic titles not inherent in the loan as such, which could justify a monetary return: pena detentiori, damnum emergens, and lucrum cessans. Pena detentiori derived from delay in the repayment of the loan, an implicit recognition of the notion of time preference. Damnum emergens was a form of recompense to indemnify the lender for losses incurred because of the loan. And lucrum cessans was consideration owed to the lender because of opportunities he had missed by virtue of granting the loan, and it, too, embodies an appreciation of time preference. Blau comments upon damnum emergens and lucrum cessans, remarking of the latter that it must be put down as a genuine analytical insight. While not all the scholastics recognized the phenomenon of time preference, St. Thomas's defender, Giles de Lessines, in 1285 clearly did, noting that future goods are not valued so highly as the same goods available at an immediate moment of time, nor do they allow their owners to achieve the same utility. For this reason, it must be considered that they have a more reduced value in accordance with justice. Even among those who lacked Giles' acuity, lucrum cessans can be taken to be an embryonic appreciation of the fact that in lending money, a lender always loses the use of that money now and recovers it only at some future time. Intuitively, we appreciate that jam today is better than jam tomorrow. As one can immediately see, there can be very few loans, perhaps none, in which there is no risk, and there are no loans that do not involve an opportunity cost, and so the exceptions stretch in effect to cover all loans, with the result that the universal prohibition becomes eviscerated. In the end, the letter of the law was observed, but as the commercial life of Christendom developed, with a corresponding developing requirement for debt financing, complicated ways emerged of circumnavigating the restrictions, such as the contractum trinius, a kind of repurchase agreement. As the utility theory of value in the pricing of goods became more clearly expressed, so the opportunity arose to apply it to the price of money in a social context in which banking was ever more prevalent and needed. There was a tendency to subsume both goods and money under a unitary theory of value. Cajetan defended the practice of banking as both useful and honourable. Moreover, he recognized the applicability of time preference to money. Money absent is always worth less than money present, and entertained the idea that the price of money might be determined as any other good by the laws of supply and demand. Saint Bernardino, too, recognized that present goods are more valuable than future goods, a principle which centuries later was invoked by the Austrian economist Wim Bawerk as the economic justification of interest. Sometimes interest charges were concealed in the discounting of exchange rates. Foreign exchange operations were another fruitful way in which the prohibition on usury could be evaded. It is easy enough to see that the third of the extrinsic titles, lucrum cessans, makes the doctrine of usury fundamentally untenable, since every lender incurs an opportunity cost in making a loan. It is perhaps not surprising that this title was rejected by some scholastics, including Thomas Aquinas. St. Bernardino, however, recognized its validity to some extent under certain conditions. De Ruyver is emphatic that the intellectual gymnastics generated around the usury doctrine contributed substantially to the discrediting of scholastic economic thought. This is all the more frustrating when one considers the sophisticated thinking evidenced in the scholastic treatment of other economic topics.